Vince, welcome to Cine-Excess 2023. It's a real pleasure to have you for this recording, and also we're going to be seeing you at the actual event. A warm welcome to Cine-Excess 2023.
Thank you so much for inviting me. When I got the email, it's like, oh, cool, this is so cool. And then when we did the premiere of I Am Monsters, my friend Patricia said, oh yes, Xavier, I know Xavier. Patricia is a professor, and I can't remember her surname for the life of me. Say again?
Patricia McCormack?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we all know and love Patricia McCormack, so we were delighted you accepted, and also we're delighted to host your sort of Cenobite colleagues as well at the event. Mm-hmm. And we're recording this to accompany I Am Monsters for audiences both at the Birmingham Electric and at the Looming Kidderminster. So we're going across the region for this event, and also for our international online audience. Obviously, we're screening the film I Am Monsters just in the UK, but it's almost like a taster for when it reaches those other shores. So welcome once again. And we're going to get straight into it, Nick. So I love the film, and it was interesting at a number of levels. So I want to sort of start by just talking about the construction of it. It's literally translated from a live theatre act, and it's framed as a play in 5 parts. So how did you make that transition from a live play to a cinematic production?
I think I was inspired or very conscious of a filmed version of Frankenstein, a one-man performance of Frankenstein that I'd seen. And the director had put the camera in the middle of the audience, and you were just watching it as if you were a member of the audience. And I've got friends who loved it, and it was an amazing performance, absolutely superb performance. But for me, it didn't translate very well. So when I was doing the one-man show, and when I thought, okay, let's do this as a documentary, a filmed version of this, I really wanted to exploit cinema. I really wanted to use close-ups, mid-shots. I wanted to involve animations. I just do something different for each section. The idea of the acts came from conversations I was having with my co-producers on the film, Paul and Stuart. And Paul had said, it kind of feels as if it should be broken up like this. And I just thought, yes, it's just a way of taking a moment, bringing down the curtain on that section, and we'll raise it again on the next section. So yeah, that was the thinking behind it.
I really love that idea of bringing the curtain down and raising it again. And it works so well in the film. And what works, as you say, is the way you bring other visual materials in to tell what's a very personal story. And the term I thought about when I was watching the movies, it's kind of like a biographical and archival recovery. And I loved, I love the idea of the use of Super 8 home footage. I love the idea of, those other archival materials, scripts, extracts. I just wondered how you approached integrating all these visual materials, also, as you say, includes animated inserts.
I think it comes back to the idea of the trying to tell the story sometimes out of order, very much because I'm leaping backwards and forwards inevitably. And I think I was very lucky because about a year into the project, suddenly a DVD turned up at home with all my father's Super 8 films. And I just thought, oh, wow, this is so cool. And the great thing was, by watching these, I realized that my dad, who was head of the Met Office at Gatwick Airport before he retired, he was a scientific officer, was also a home filmmaker. And in the days where you used to film things in order and then splice them together with little filmed title cards and so on to make up stories and so on. And I thought, watched those things and I thought, oh, that's really kind of interesting. And then it was just in talking, because it's based on the one-man show that I did at London Horror Festival in 2019. when I was talking about, spoilers, the stuff that was going on when I was 19 years old, I thought, I really want to try and explain and show visually and graphically what was actually going on. And again, I remember having conversations with my co-producers, Paul and Stuart, and we trying to work out how can we explain it, but also kind of make it visceral, but not make it too visceral. So, because if you make it too shocking, too, I came at what I'm talking about is a medical procedure, and I realized that I could go onto Fiverr and you can get people who will show you exactly what it is like. And I've in fact found video of the operation that I had done. And I just thought, now this is too much. If I put that in, people are just going to look away. And I don't want them to look away. I just want to understand what I was going through. So I was as conscious as possible for the audience, trying to communicate to the audience what it was I was trying to say.
It works brilliantly. And as you say, it's the right balance between exposition and entertainment without being exploitative. That's what I love about it. And as you said, it's an extremely personal film. And a line that struck with me is a line you've taken when reciting, classic horror literature, the idea of animal to human surgery. And that was used to reflect on your own perceptions of physiology. And I just wondered how you saw your own body and human identity in relation to those past medical experiences.
I think, it's really interesting you pick up on that point, because that is literally what happened. I remember very vividly standing in front of the mirror, and that was the image, that was the book, that was the thing that I had going on in my mind as to what it is. I think we are creatures of flesh. I always reckon that my problem is I'm far too much in my head. Which is why I never go to the gym. I really should. I really should take a lot more exercise than I do. Because I'm all up here and thinking about stuff or dreaming about stuff and so on. So I think that exploration of something, which obviously ends up and it's very related to Hellraiser and in particular Nightbeat and being monstrous and so on. All Clive's work, which I think is one of the reasons we got on so well together, is because, yeah, I think if you go through these things, you become very aware of the physical and very aware of pain and very aware of what it is, being, as I say, far too much time in my own body, but also being very aware of physical constraints and reactions and what it is to be a human being.
Thank you for that. It's a really, very personal response. And I think horror fans will look at this film and they will gravitate towards those personal responses. So horror fans are in there. We are sort of a very reflective individuals, and I think a lot of horror fans will also will relate to the idea of elements of oppression or bullying that you so personally bring out. And you also made a comment in the film that stuck with me, which is the way in which monster figures are always related to normality, and the thing we should fear are the folk with a pitchfork, to quote you. And I just wonder if you've got some brief reflections on whether you see horror in any way as a quite radical vehicle for upending or upturning our perceptions of what's, quote, normal and abnormal.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think that you've obviously hit on one of the key parts of horror. I suppose for example, when I'm writing horror, I write short horror fiction, working on some stories at the moment. I always allow myself one thing that's different, one thing that's not normal. I like my horror to be as normal, ordinary in the real world as possible, but I'm going to twist one thing and just look at something slightly differently. And I think for horror to be effective, it does need that. I'm thinking for Nightmare on Elm Street, just a very simple concept. We all go to sleep, it's right. It's been a bad day. Don't worry about it. Just go to sleep. You'll be fine. Things will be better in the morning. This whole idea that when you go to sleep, that's where the monster is. And I think that is what makes the most effective horror, as far as I'm concerned, is the stuff that you can believe is real. The thing that follows you at night and walks 10 paces behind you. There's that lovely line in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner where he talks about like one who walks on and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Misquoting that really badly, but it is just, those moments, those very simple things where you're saying, okay, what if this real person had this extraordinary thing? I suppose the things, the genre that really tackles societal, I can't even say the word, society or societal norms, of course, is science fiction. Immediately thinking of Soylent Green. Just wonderful, wonderful film. Though, those are on the broader scale. So if you like, science fiction tends to speak about society as a whole. Horror speaks to the personal experience, without all the trappings of Logan's Run or anything like that. It really I think the effective stuff speaks to the personal experience.
I really love that response, Nick. And I also love, I'm going to sort of try and envelope the two film examples that you used here, Nightmare on Elm Street and Soylent Green. And the connection for me seems to be that both films deal with the fear of an individual or groups that are marginalized. So, of course, the fear of Nightmare on Elm Street, very much as you said, is you go, there's something that's supposed to give you reprieve and release going to sleep becomes monstrous because there's a killer there. But the interesting thing about Nightmare on Elm Street, of course, is it's a very working class character who's popped up in American suburbia. The fascinating thing about Soylent Green is it was one of the first films, I believe, that Edward G. Robinson appeared in after his former years of being blacklisted as a suspected communist, right? And so where I'm going with this is whether it's kind of political sci-fi or radical horror, the great thing is the way in which these become vessels to explore those communities that are marginalized by mainstream society. And why that resonates for me, going back to I Am Monsters, is the very powerful and very personal interludes you gave throughout the film as a gay man growing up during Thatcher's Britain, and all of those challenges and almost coping mechanisms that you had to deal with. Now, for our younger colleagues watching this interview and watching the documentary, that they still may struggle with how dramatic a set of changes there've been. But just very briefly, just remind us, talk us through what it was like in that decade of repression.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I think it's because, and think of Nightmare on Elm Street for a moment as well. I think the other outside group is the teenagers. The adults aren't attacked. It's the teenagers, which is obviously what the audience is aimed for. And I think that's part of its charm and effectiveness, which is why, so to remind people of what it was like during Thatcher's Britain, there were two things going on. There was AIDS. It was just horrific. I think probably anyone now watching this will remember a couple of years back when we had the pandemic and there was this horrible disease that was killing people, but it was huge and everybody was in the same boat together. The thing about AIDS was and particularly at the beginning, it was defined as the gay plague. It was acquired immune deficiency syndrome. it was very much a gay thing. And this naturally, so whenever you have got, and throughout, you know, the moment a disease enters a society, people look for a scapegoat, whether it be a pangolin, a bat, and you know, there's got to be a blame. The Chinese, whatever it is, somebody has got to be a blame. It can't be us, can't be our fault, can't be anything we've done. It must be them. And I think what Thatcher took advantage of, and we see it today with the Conservative government, it happens to be refugees and trans people these days. Thatcher's day, it was being gay. I still remember the horrible speech she gave at the party conference, you know, saying children being taught that being gay was okay, was denying them their futures and so on. And so, you know, you had Section 28. Section 20, sorry, you had, so in Thatcher's Britain, you had Section 28, or Clause 28 as it was. It's the same thing, which is literally discriminating against. And it sounds quite innocuous, it's like local authorities can't do this. But what that meant was that any program that was funded by the local council, who had a lot more power and responsibility in those days in terms of youth clubs, etc., going into school, these were all being defunded, to use a modern phrase. And I know, because I remember the statistics of the time, that young male suicide rates went up during that period. And I think, you know, this is what happens when you try and marginalize. So all that's kind of to give you a historical context.
And it's much needed. And I think it just reminds us all the true value of horror is it always reveals what happens when you lose your moral compass. And that's why these films remain so valuable. And on that theme, a couple of questions to close. I mean, you mentioned the brilliance of Clive Barker earlier in the interview, and throughout the documentary, you talk, you know, about your ongoing respect for and collaborations with Clive Barker. So how would you briefly surmise his contribution to horror cinema?
I think my flip answer to this question is about Hellraiser. No teenagers were harmed during the making of this movie, because because it's about adults. It's very much, you know, we talk about Nightmare on Elm Street, we talk about Stalk and Slash. I'm not criticizing any of those at all. I love Nightmare on Elm Street. But the great joy of what Clive did in Hellraiser, as far as I'm concerned, you know, it was very much about adults. It was very much about sex, and it was very much about death. It was very much about pain and sex. There is such a strong sadomasochistic thing. And I think I've always liked intelligent horror, by which I mean things like Roger Corman's The Mask of the Red Death, which is a philosophical film. You know, he talks. Vincent Price has a great speech about fear, but also the conversations with Jane Asher about, you know, if God was truly good, he wouldn't allow this horrible plague that they're going through. Therefore, let's worship the devil, because obviously the devil is the god of this world. God is obviously not around it. You know, how can you say it'd be a god of love? I think the Clive's thing is he has such a fresh and original view, and I think this is what he brought to Hellraiser. And then when we did Nightbreed, I think it, again, one of the problems that the studio really struggled with, because they thought they were going to get another Hellraiser, is that he completely flips it on his head and said, no, the monsters really are the good guys. You know, it's coming back to pitchforks and a mob. You know, that whole sequence of the Sons of the Free. Yeah, right. Your freedom, nobody else's freedom. For those who haven't seen Nightbreed, that's thinking, you know, he's good at that, and it comes back to what you were saying earlier on about flipping things on their head, putting a slight twist, but with Clive's unique vision, which, I know obviously we're talking about horror, but of course Clive's expanded that into the aberrat, and all these different weird and wonderful creatures, and Weave World, one of my favorites of Clive's books. Then I think this is and he brings that imagination that can create worlds like Weave World and the aberrat, etc. And he brings these into Hellraiser. And I'm really pleased that you're also showing Hellbound as part of the festival as well, because the two don't so beautifully dovetail together, where, you know, you've got the very, literally it's just set in a house and a hospital ward at one point, but mostly it's all set around this one house. It's very, very small. And then in the sequel, you go to hell, and hell is huge. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So I think that's what his real contribution is.
Thank you. Final question. And it's probably the question you expected at the beginning, but I purposely put it at the end, which is just to say Hellraiser was obviously profoundly influential when it was released. For contemporary horror audience, why do you think that influence remains for the new viewers of horror cinema?
It's really difficult to answer. I mean, I'm always delighted when I meet new fans and I chat to them, and I think, you weren't born when we made this film. And I think sometimes it's a kind of family thing. It's handed down from parents to children, you know, and we're now kind of easily into third generation now. It's grandchildren who've learned it from their parents, who were then shown it by their parents or taken to the cinema by their parents. So I think there's that, you know, there is a familial thing. I think the truths within Hellraiser, as I said, you know, we're talking about sex, death, and starshine, to quote one of Clive's stories. Those things are never going to go away. Sex and death, pain, enjoyment, going to the limits, going too far, seeking the ultimate in pleasure. Those things are never going to change. I think, you know, that because Clive speaks to the human condition, he speaks to the flesh so evocatively. So I think, though, you know, outside familial influences, I think those are the things that probably inspire and entertain a modern audience.
Nick, Vince, thank you so much for joining us here at Cine-Excess 2023.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Xavier.